Okay, I am unmuted now, and thank you so much, everybody, for coming today. Thank you, Mike Rugel, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you to Sheldon Goldberg too for recommending my book to the museum and to the museum itself, who organized this event. Thank you very much, and it's a real honor and a privilege to be able to talk about the book Comrades Betrayed to you. I've always enjoy talking to veterans and to groups like this. But this format, I have to start by saying that this is still a little bit new to me. I've never given such a large talk online before. I'm still kind of used to the face-to-face lectures and brick and mortar, one-on-one meetings or presentations. So this is still a little bit new to me, and I have to say that Mike, he did a tremendous job showing me that how WebEx works, how this platform works. So if there are any glitches, if there are any problems here, then that's entirely my fault. So I'd like to start. What I'm going to do is tell you what I promise you. It's going to be a very fascinating story, and I have to say I'm a little bit. I'm not impartial to this topic, but it's truly a fascinating story. Ultimately, a tragic one, however. And it's a story that I came across years ago after reading about Jewish soldiers in World War I for the first time, and ever since I was a teenager, really, I've had a passion for World War I, and I started reading about Jewish soldiers in the German army. Some of this literature first started to emerge in the late 80s and in the 90s. And at the same time, I also noticed Jewish names on war memorials in Germany growing up. Now, I should preface this by saying that I was born in Germany. My father is an American. My mother's German. I lived there for several years before we moved to the States, and I spent a lot of my summers there as a kid. I still go back and visit frequently. I was a little bit of a nerd at a very early age, so I was fascinated by war memorials. I liked actually going up and reading names and just seeing what was written on there. And I noticed that there were Jewish names, and as the names of the fallen were inscribed in the monuments, that there were Jewish names on there. And at the same time, I started to really take an interest in Nazi Germany, what happened during this period. And I immediately wondered about this cohort of Jewish men who had served in the German army in World War I. What happened to them after 1933? And how did they experience the rise of Hitler? How did they experience National Socialism and the Holocaust? And the story of this book, really, to a large degree, it starts with a photo of Richard Stern, which I'm going to share with you right now. Actually, before I share this with you, I want to show you the very first book where I saw the Stern photo. The Stern photo is Richard Stern. He's on the cover of the book. And this is a book that was published in the mid-1990s in Germany by the German Center for Military History, the equivalent of the German Center for Military History. It's part of the German Armed Forces. They do research, and this was a museum catalog. They had an exhibit on Jewish service in the German Armed Forces that traveled throughout Germany, and they had the Richard Stern photo here in an article. I'll show it to you right here. But this was the confounding thing. I mean, they had the photograph there. Not much explanation, not much in the way of the history of what happened to Jewish soldiers after World War I and after Hitler came to power, just that photo. And now let me share this here. One moment. Here is the photo I just showed you, and here is Richard Stern, and he's standing in front of his shop in Cologne on April 1st, 1933. This was the day of the April boycott. And what immediately struck me by looking at the photo, I mean, there's a sense of betrayal here. Here's a hero of the Great War being persecuted, and this was in many ways an appeal to justice. That was one of my first. That was one of my first reactions. But really, what struck me here was what was Stern's posture, his body language, and his attitude. And sorry, I'm just getting a couple of messages here. Okay, this body language and his attitude, and every time I looked at it, I was just struck by Stern's defiance. I mean, here he is standing next to a stormtrooper, Nazi stormtrooper, two Nazi stormtroopers actually. There's this man here at the center to the left of the photograph, and it looks like he's saluting, or somebody is saluting him, or we're speaking with him. And Stern is here in the middle, and he's not intimidated. He's not doesn't seem very impressed by these Nazi thugs that are in front of his store. He's unafraid. He's wearing the Iron Cross he'd earned in World War I, while this young, kind of pubescent SA man clearly was too young to have ever served in the military. And the Nazi stormtroopers almost diminished by Stern's presence. And if you look at it closely, it seems like he's really uncomfortable with this scene here. And so what struck me here was that the power here lies with Stern, with this old soldier from the First World War. It's almost like he's thrown down a gauntlet to this SA men picketing his shop. And it was this attitude, it was this courage, a kind of this defiance in the face of impossible odds that immediately drew my attention. And I don't think I've ever still to this day, I don't think I've ever come across this kind of photograph of a Nazi perpetrator and a Jewish victim before, where the power really resides with the victim. This is something unique. And it raised a lot of other questions here. It raised, I look at the other Germans here. There's at least one or two other people in the photograph. We can't see their reactions here, but the man has his hands in his pockets. He's clearly Stern it's unclear what his relationship is, but clearly there seems to be some solidarity with the crowd in front of his store. And we know that too because this crowd kept on getting bigger and bigger, and eventually the SA troop in front of the store left. They packed up and they left Stern alone. Stern was briefly arrested, but he was let go. And importantly, why did the Nazis allow this to happen? While this was going on with Stern, all around the city in Cologne, other Jews were being arrested. They were being boycotted. Some of them were being bullied, and some were being physically abused as well. But not Stern. And this is what really fascinated me. And the photograph, it really challenged a lot of what I knew at the time. And I think it challenges a lot of notions that you still find in the history of the Holocaust, right? That Jews were rendered powerless, or where they were passive victims in the face of Nazi aggression, that they had been neighborless, that they were socially isolated after 1933, that they had no more allies. And I wanted to know more about this. And at the same time, I was surprised how little was written on this topic. I mean, it blew my mind. The mid-90s, this was before the internet, so I couldn't really find out that much right away. But in graduate school, when I spoke to my advisor and I told him I really wanted to write on this topic, I found out that nobody really had done a lot of work on this before. There's work on Jewish soldiers in World War I, some work on Jewish veterans in the Weimar Republic, but nothing after 1933. And nothing after 1933. And one of the reasons is records. We don't have a lot of records from that time period, but this is immediately, this really was something I wanted to do. So here, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to speak about Jewish veterans of World War I, who they were and how they experienced the Nazi years in the Holocaust. I have to restrain myself here. I tend to speak fast, and I like to talk about this subject, and I could talk about it for a very long time, and in hopes of telling everybody everything I know about it, but that's impossible. So I'm going to speak for 30 to 35 minutes, and I'm going to turn it over for questions, and hopefully we'll have a conversation for the rest of the meeting here. So let me go on, and I'm going to change my slide here. I'm getting a couple of requests to annotate here. I don't know. So I want to go back in time a little bit to August 1914, and this is the beginning of the World War I. And when Germany went to war there in that August, there was a groundswell, a massive outpouring of patriotic sentiment as volunteers from all across Germany rushed to the recruitment depots and enlisted and volunteered in the hopes that they would be part of this great war before it was over. There's a real fear, and we hear these stories of other wars before that people would miss out on the action. And so there's a flood of volunteers, and Jews were among some of the most ardent supporters of the war in 1914. Jewish students, young German Jews. And during that conflict, 100,000 Jews served in the German armed forces. 12,000 were killed, and 35,000 received medals, received decorations for bravery. In addition, by 1918, there had been 2,000 Jewish soldiers who had been promoted, who had been commissioned as officers. And it's important to remember that in 1914, there were virtually no Jewish officers in the German army. The Prussian army did not commission any Jews at all. There were only a handful of Jews in the Bavarian army, which kind of had it was kind of a separate contingent. It had its own, operated according to its own rules, and it was semi-independent before 1914. But in the Prussian army and all the other states, Jews and other groups were not permitted to become officers. So these 2,000 officers were received field commissions, and they were commissioned based on their performance in the front lines. They rose up through the ranks. In addition, there were almost an equal number of medical officers as well. And so in 1933, we have roughly, and again, the numbers are hard to come by just because of lack of records, but roughly 80 to 85,000 Jews who had veteran status in 1933 when Hitler came to power. And this was a large group and a diverse group of people in many ways. There were many, the majority of them were of the Jewish soldiers or the Jewish veterans were part of the liberal Reform community. They were Reform Jews, but there were also a handful of Orthodox Jews there. There were Zionists. There were Jews who to whom being Jewish did not play a big role. There were secular. Then there were other Jews who had converted, who were later persecuted as Jews, but had converted to Christianity a long time ago, and who thought of themselves as Protestant or Catholic. So there's really a broad range of really a myriad group. Although most of the ages were similar, there were also older Jews in their 30s and 40s who volunteered to serve as well. But, out of this group, out of this large group, there are a couple things in common here that really distinguish veterans from, what I'm going to call ordinary Jews. In other words, non-military Jews, those who were either too young or too old to have served in the army in World War I. And the first thing was that with veterans was that overwhelmingly they were middle class. Overwhelmingly they were acculturated German Jews. They considered themselves assimilated into German culture. And number two was that fighting in the war led to the development of certain ways of thinking and acting that were very different from Jews or from any individuals who had not served in the army. In other words, military service and experienced the war, it shaped the way they thought and the way they behaved during the Nazi years. And there's evidence for this. There's evidence is in the fact that Jews and Jews' attendance at regimental reunions after the war, their participation in veterans groups after the war, and in their frequent invocations of their frequent writings and their personal writings or invocations of the war after 1918, even in the darkest moments of the Holocaust, they were writing diaries and letters to their families, to their sweethearts, and they were still talking about World War I, kind of comparing their predicament in the Nazi years to what they experienced now. I almost disregarded this slide here. Here are a couple of World War I soldiers, and this man on the left here is Hugo Gutmann. He was actually Hitler's company commander in the List Regiment in the First World War. Hitler served in his company, and lieutenant. He's a first lieutenant when he got out. He actually put Hitler in for the Iron Cross, which he was later about to receive. This would cause some problems for Gutmann later on. The man on the left is Stern, Richard Stern, who's on the cover of the book and who we just looked at. This is him as a machine gunner on the Western Front in 1916. In addition, I'm sorry, I moved too fast here. So, and finally, another commonality here is that in addition to volunteering to serve and hoping to serve out of duty, out of a commitment to Germany, out of this desire to prove their manhood, right? I mean, soldiers want to prove their courage in battle. They wanted to prove their mettle as comrades and as brave soldiers. You know, the Jewish soldiers wanted this as well, but there was something else here. And this becomes very palpable when you read their early letters and diary entries in the war and much later, is this desire to subvert anti-Semitic stereotypes, this desire to kind of turn on their head these stereotypes of Jews as being effeminate, as being physically unfit, and this stereotype of the anti-Semitic stereotypes of Jews as disloyal to the nation. This is also what they sought to disprove. And this is one of the reasons why you see Jewish enthusiasm at the beginning of World War I, because they hope that demonstrations of bravery and courage in the front line would bring full Jewish emancipation after the war. And this did these values that Jewish soldiers took with them to the front lines. One of the things I argue in the book is that these values also later made it impossible to passively accept persecution under the Nazis. And so I want to move now into the Nazi period and look at some of their early reactions to National Socialism. And unfortunately, with Richard Stern, we have photographs from him. He didn't leave many written records, at least not ones that I've encountered. And by the way, there's also going to be a biography of Richard Stern is in the works right now. It's being written by his nephew, and his nephew. I'll talk about that book towards the end, and that's going to be published hopefully by the end of this year or next year, I believe, from Amsterdam Press. But I personally did not have a lot of information on Richard Stern besides his photograph. But there were other Jewish veterans who did describe their experiences in the early Nazi years in pretty great detail. And what I found out was that Richard Stern, him standing in front of his shop in Cologne, it was not an anomaly. It actually happened in cities and towns throughout Germany during the April boycott, where Jewish veterans, as their stores were being picketed by Nazi thugs, they would put on their uniforms or their medals and stand in front of their stores and challenge the SA troops that were out there. And one of the Jewish veterans who did this was Eric Leyens. And you see him in the photograph on the left. He's all the way on the left. He's this small, he looks very young there. This is 1914, looks much too young to be a soldier. But nevertheless, he did volunteer for the war. He became an officer, and he was highly decorated by the end of it. And Leyens lived in a town called Wesel in Germany. This is a town up in the Rhineland. On April 1st, the Nazi stormtroopers, they blocked the entrance to his store. And he reacted by putting on his old uniform. He pinned on his Iron Cross first class that he earned as an infantry officer. And the night before, he'd printed leaflets decrying the Nazis' treatment of veterans. And as he did this, we see a similar scene what happened in Cologne. This really became a kind of a sensation in the town. It became a public spectacle as people were walking by and stopped to see what was going on. And you see this crowd building in front of Stern's department store. And this crowd was actually siding with Layens. They were calling for the SA troop to leave. They were calling for the SA troop to stop, to stop this harassment of this former soldier of the Great War. The SA eventually they called these guards back. 2 hours later, they had to leave because it was causing such a spectacle and even impeding traffic in the small town. According to Layens, he had one of the most profitable days of his life. He had an apartment store in the small town. And the next day, the following day, the newspaper, a newspaper there, this was before the Nazis took it over, not a left-leaning paper either. This was a conservative newspaper, lauded Layens' quote-unquote courage, for standing up to his accusers and for quote-unquote proving his Germanness. And this is I think this is a key phrase here. You see it again and again, this idea that by having served in the military, you kind of prove your Germanness, you earn your German credentials. This is something we would hear again and again. And again, Stern, Layens, these were by no means exceptions. This good-looking man you see on the right here, this is Siegbert Gerechter. Unfortunately, I don't have a photograph of him in his later years, but this is him early on in the war. He'd already earned his Iron Cross. He became an officer too. It's very unfortunate because I received these photographs from his daughter. And just after I received them, not long after his daughter passed away, I couldn't get more. I wasn't able to include them in the book, and unfortunately, this is one comes across this when you're dealing with this generation of people here. But Gerechter, in addition to his impressive war record, which I write a little about in the book, was his reactions after 1933. He wore his medals in public, as many Jews did. And at one point, he heard, when he was in a cafe in 1934, he heard one of the customers making loud, brazen anti-Semitic remarks. Gerechter, he got up and confronted the man and told him that he was going to stand for this. There's almost an altercation until Gerechter, he identified himself as a veteran and he exposed his Iron Cross. At which point the man apologized, profusely apologized, and left, and the situation was de-escalated. There are many more incidents like this. There were physical altercations, quite a few of them, but this really says a lot about the sense of defiance, the sense of courage, and I think this kind of belief that Jewish veterans, by challenging their accusers, they were also defending their honor, not just their personal honor, but also a Jewish honor in general. And if you look at people, again, on these photographs, I was always also interested in the people who are watching these spectacles. I mean, and not just the Jewish veterans, but what were the ordinary Germans on the street thinking? What were they doing at the time? And Vesa, certainly there was this kind of solidarity with him there. There's this really outrage that these Nazi ruffians were harassing a Great War veteran, who had enjoyed a very high status in Nazi Germany. And it wasn't just ordinary people on the street who were affected by these kind of demonstrations of courage and defiance. And they even had an impact in the highest levels of government. And on this picture, you see Hitler, of course. On the left is President, the old Field Marshal von Hindenburg. And von Hindenburg, he received a series of letters beginning in January 1933 by Jewish veterans, and from a Jewish war widow who wrote repeatedly saying that they were being harassed, that their reputation was being besmirched in public, and Hindenburg was outraged to such a degree that he called in Hitler for a meeting and ordered him to immediately desist and to exempt to make legal exemptions for Jewish veterans and their families. He's very adamant about the fact that their families should also be included. And what's interesting here is that Hindenburg was no friend of the Jews. I mean, he certainly was an anti-Semite as well. But he also had, this attitude that those Jews who had fought in the army in World War I, who had fought at the front, who had proven themselves that they had also proven their loyalty to the nation, that they were somehow exceptional, that they were to be treated from the other mass, quote unquote, massive Jewry as he saw it. Hindenburg had no qualms about the persecution of Jews. He never objected to any of the anti-Jewish measures that the Nazis put out. Only when it came to veterans, the only time he would ever get involved, veterans and war widows. The gentleman you see in the front here is Field Marshal Werner von Blomberg, and he was Hitler's defense minister. He was really a Nazi toad. He was a conservative, but very, very quickly he accommodated himself with the regime. Instituted an Aryan paragraph later on, but in 1933 it was Blomberg who protested to higher ups when Jewish veterans were faced with expulsion from the national from the German Veterans Association, the Kyffhäuserbund, and he petitioned unsuccessfully, but he still argued that they had proven themselves and therefore exceptions should be made for them. They should be able to keep their place in the Veterans Association. And probably one of the more famous examples, right? I think one of the most surprising examples is that of this man here, Field Marshal Erich von Munstein. Now, Munstein, many of you might have known, if you're a military history buff, you'll certainly have known him. He was seen as one of the, probably one of the most successful German commanders during the Second World War. He really fought a series of quite impressive engagements on the Eastern Front. But crucially, before that, as a colonel in 1934, after Blomberg was trying to expel Jews from the army, it was Munstein who was the sole voice of dissent. And he put together, as he found out that one of his lieutenants was going to be kicked out of the army for being Jewish, for having he had a Jewish father, I believe it was. Munstein, he put together a petition, a 14-page long petition, which he presented to his chain of command, which went all the way up to the highest level, went all the way up to Blomberg. And he was very adamant on the fact that, number one, he supported Nazi anti-Semitic policy. There was no question about this, but he found it outrageous that Jewish soldiers were being targeted by these same policies. That he thought was a disgrace. And he reacted forcefully and courageously, even. I mean, he really put his career on the line when he did this. And shockingly, though, this was the same Field Marshal Munstein who led the 11th Army in the Crimea in the Second World War, and countenanced the murder of I believe it was at least 29,000 Soviet Jews in his direct area of operations. And he also issued a number of anti-Semitic decrees. So again, here you have this case of perpetrators acting decently and behaving differently towards Jewish veterans, that were somehow seen as being different or exceptional compared to other Jews. Now, something about these exemptions I mentioned. Hindenburg he forced Hitler to create an exemptions for Jewish veterans. So as Jewish veterans were being thrown out of their jobs, prevented from going to universities, for example, as Jews, I'm sorry. Veterans, however, were exempted, and they were allowed to retain their posts. When Hindenburg died, a lot of these laws went by the wayside. But even after Kristallnacht in 1938, when there was a pogrom, this violent pogrom that racked Germany, and over 30,000 Jews had been arrested, we see here that immediately after these mass arrests, Jewish veterans were released after just 1 month, while other Jews, other non-military Jews, were incarcerated for several months, maybe even up to a year at a time in some cases. And finally, in the Wannsee Conference in 1942, as the Nazis are organizing the mass murder of the Jews and trying to figure out logistically how to go about putting their plans into practice, we know this. We know because we have a very detailed record of this here. There were two exemptions that were in that document. Two exemptions for elderly Jews, number one, and for again for Jewish veterans. And Heydrich and Eichmann was the author of the document. He made a very interesting statement. He said, you know, with these exemptions, by sending veterans to not to Auschwitz or to death camps in the East, they were being sent to a new quote unquote privileged ghetto, Theresienstadt. By sending them there, they would head off many interventions. You know, and you know, meaning that the SS was constantly being petitioned by officers like Munstein and by even by Nazi party officials to make exemptions for Jewish soldiers. And I see as I'm talking here, questions are popping up, and I'm looking forward to answering some of these. I'm gonna move a little bit quickly here because I'm already failing on one of my promises not to talk too long here. I want to open it up to conversations, but really briefly here, going back to the Jewish veterans, how they experienced this. The fact that they had connections, the fact that they had, especially for former officers who were later in positions of power during the Third Reich, and the fact that they had been involved in the veterans community for so long, it also meant that they weren't isolated, that they weren't thrust into the social wilderness after 1933, as many Jews were, you know, after being expelled from school, from work, from their organizations they belonged to. Here is a Wehrmacht unit photo, and in this photo is as far as I can determine, probably the last, if not one of the last, Jewish soldiers openly serving in the Wehrmacht. And I don't know if you can see my mouse here, but this man right here. So he's sitting right in the middle, right to the left of this first sergeant, the guy holding the sword. That was Otto Levine, and I was fortunate enough to meet his son, who's still alive and living in Germany, and he shared these documents with me. And Levine was supposed to have been expelled by the Wehrmacht in 1934 when they passed an Aryan paragraph. But first off, he was a frontline fighter, but also his chain of command shielded him for quite some time, as much as they could. Not only that, but he's also promoted after 1934. He became a staff sergeant. He was an NCO at the time. In 1936, he was finally dismissed. But even then, throughout the Nazi years and until the early war, he kept on receiving, according to his son, visits by comrades. They would take him out. Later on, this became in the dead of night, so somebody could see. Or they would take him out to the pub for formal gatherings, and on Kristallnacht, as other Jews in the street, as neighbors were being arrested, he was spared. Yeah, but another. I'm sorry. I thought I was in a different place here. I want to get back to Hugo Gutmann very briefly, who you saw earlier. He was Hitler's company commander, as I'd mentioned before, and for this reason, the SS wanted to get a hold of him because they feared, and they feared right, that he had some damaging information on Hitler. We know now that, you know, his Iron Cross. I mean, it's kind of debatable whether this was really an award for bravery or not. But the SS wanted to get a hold of him early on, and he was arrested a number of times and pursued and harassed. One of the times he was arrested in 1936, and he was supposed to go to a Gestapo prison. He was freed due to interventions from former officers of his regiment, and they included an unknown general who he doesn't name. But they also include a man by the name of Fritz Wiedemann, who became Hitler's adjutant, and he was Hitler's adjutant at that time. He pretty much arranged for Gutmann to be released from jail. Gutmann too, during Kristallnacht, during the pogrom, he was helped by comrades, and he was hidden at a farmhouse while that happened, and he was helped to flee the country as well. But it shows you that a lot of veterans, especially former officers like this, you know, they had connections. Some of their comrades from World War I were now colonels, generals were important people in the Nazi government, and I want to point out that these were paths that weren't open to quote unquote ordinary Jews during the Third Reich. Other Jews who had not served in the army just didn't have this opportunity to escape persecution. And I want to move now. The picture you see here is 1938, Kristallnacht, to the pogrom. And you see Jews being arrested here, and the man in front of the lead, he actually was a Jewish. He was a Jewish war veteran who was being arrested there, and they weren't exempt from these mass arrests that happened throughout Germany on November 9th and 10th, 1938. And by this time, to be sure, Jewish veterans' concern was to survive physically. They're, just much like other Jews, they sought to survive. They wanted to emigrate. They wanted to protect their home. They wanted to protect their loved ones. But even at this stage of the Third Reich, when violence was breaking out, they still fought to protect their honor. Their soldierly honor and Jewish honor, which was now increasingly being put to the test, and we see this here in some of the writings that by Jewish veterans after Kristallnacht. Harvard University, by the way, has a very valuable manuscript collection that was collected in 1939 and 1940. And many Jews, there are about 350 manuscripts there. So they were written after 1938. Many of the writers were survivors of this pogrom, but it was also written before knowledge of the Holocaust was available at this time, before common knowledge of what was really going on, was really before this was known. So this is a really valuable source, and one of the people who wrote about this at the time, that's in the Harvard collection, is a man by the name of Albert Schwerin. And when he right after he was released from Dachau, he sat down and he wrote about his experiences. And he started off by saying that never had, quote unquote, I have never seen so many men cry at Dachau. And when he wrote these words, it's interesting, Schwerin was not talking about him. He was not referring to himself here. He was describing these events not as a victim, but kind of as an observer. He was talking about other men crying at Dachau, not him. And Schwerin, he describes going through Dachau, being subjected to same kind of severe mental and physical abuse, the physical beatings, the sleep deprivation, the lack of food and water, horrible bathroom facilities. But he states from early on he was determined to overcome these depredations. And according to him, quote unquote, I wanted to rise to the occasion, to persevere, and to make it out in one piece. And from early on, he attributed his ability to adapt to the camp, to not be intimidated by the guards, for example, and by this discipline. He attributed this to what he experienced as a soldier in World War I. All these formations and these roll calls, these sadistic guards, they didn't intimidate him, as he wrote, stating that he had seen far worse in the trenches of World War I, where he'd been wounded 3 times. And this is a recurring message when you look at these writings about Kristallnacht. They were over to overcome the wounds inflicted by the SS physically and psychologically. Because of their military record. This became kind of an endurance test. And I think this was more than a demonstration of manhood, right? They're doing more than just trying to prove their male toughness. I think it was a deliberate strategy to alleviate the shame and the powerlessness that they felt. And it was a means to defy the Nazis as they tried to strip Jews of their honor, their dignity, and their manhood. And so so already in 1938, I mean, these accounts in many ways, they challenged the notions that Jews were left diminished and powerless by Nazi terror, because clearly in the minds of these Jewish victims, they had not. I thought I had this before here. So I want to show you now, this is one of the last individuals I'm going to show you here. This is a man by the name of Philip Maines. And he was a prisoner at Theresienstadt concentration camp, as at the Theresienstadt ghetto. As I mentioned before, in 1942 at the Wannsee Conference, as the Third Reich was organizing the mass deportation of Jews from Germany to death camps in Eastern Europe and Poland and in the occupied East, Jewish veterans, at least those who were highly decorated or had suffered war wounds, they were exempt. They would not be put on these transports. They would be sent south to into what's today the Czech Republic, to Terezín, to Theresienstadt. And this was a privileged ghetto, a quote-unquote privileged ghetto that was supposedly designed just for German Jews, older Jews and distinguished Jews, and for veterans. We know now that this was not the case. I mean, this was just a theoretical construction. This was merely a way station on the way to Auschwitz. Once the Jewish veterans were out of Germany, they were usually sent in second-class railway cars, not in the cattle cars and not in the same means that one usually thinks of these deportations. Once they were out of Germany, at Terezín, they were then sent to Auschwitz eventually. One of the men who was sent here was Philip Maines. He had been a soldier in World War I. Obviously, he was a sergeant. And when he got to Theresienstadt, he had already endured about 8 or 9 years of Nazi persecution by that point. He was one of the only ones. He was able to keep a detailed diary of what happened, so he described a lot. And what struck me here was even after experiencing years of persecution, he'd been in the camp in this miserable ghetto. It was anything but privileged. Conditions there were horrendous. Despite that, though, his sense of belonging to Germany, his inner sense of belonging to Germany never wavered. He still held on to this German identity until the very end. For example, writing here, he would urge his fellow prisoners as they started to fall into despair. He said, "Don't be dismayed, do not be resigned to despair. Did we, as we stood at the front and stared so often into the pallid face of death, fall into dismay? We did not. We stood upright. Our love of the fatherland kept us from losing courage. So it should now." And throughout his diaries, I mean, you see these expressions of German nationalism really until the end, just before he was deported to Auschwitz. One of the last things he wrote was he bemoaned the bombing raids that were being carried out about German cities, and he said, "Hearing the news of the bombing of Berlin and not Dresden, Leipzig, and all these other cities," he said, "that really strikes his heart, because these were his cities too." And it wasn't just Mainz. There were many Jews at this time who were keeping diaries who still refused to relinquish this German identity. Victor Klemperer in Dresden, who was living underground in confinement actually at this time, the way he said it was that I'm the real German here. The Nazis, they are un-German. They're not the real Germans, and I'm going to wait until they go back underground. And this was really remarkable. And I think many of these Jewish inmates at the time, it was almost, again, this sense of defiance here. They were defying their tormentors by refusing to submit to this Nazi stereotype Jew, quote unquote Jew, by stubbornly clinging to this German identity. Because, I mean, after all, this is what the Nazis tried to deprive Jews of from the beginning, right? This assertion of German identity, and this was still what they were doing here. Mainz, unfortunately, again, this is a tragic story, and Maine wrote some of these lines just before he was deported to Auschwitz in October 1944. As the war ended, as the Soviet army was advancing, as the Third Reich was literally in its death throes, a decision was made to deport all the privileged, quote unquote, privileged Jewish veterans from Theresienstadt to Auschwitz. And this happened in September and October 1944. They were part of the last mass deportation from Terezín to Auschwitz, and most of them did not survive. And one of those who was on that transport was Philip Maines. I want to end though on, and I'm gonna be quiet here. I'm gonna in 2 minutes, but I want to end on a little bit of a positive note here. As I said, this is a tragic story, but there are also a lot of inspirational stories here, and I think this is one of them. It's a strange story. It's an inspirational one, and it's one of these stories that you really can't make up. In this photo here is Herbert Zoltzbach, I also have this photograph in my book. He's the man sitting on the shoulders of his comrades here in World War I. Highly patriotic. He was an officer during World War I. He fought in the Freikorps briefly after when he returned to his home in Frankfurt. And during the early Nazi years, he'd been working on his memoirs, which were in diary form, and he published these deliberately in 1933. They were actually published in 1934 for the first time. Later, this you see here, this is the English edition. Many of you might have seen this. It might be at the bookstore. It's a very, very popular book these days, really a fantastic book about World War I. But originally, it was published in German in 1934. And interestingly enough, the Nazis didn't know that this was a Jewish author, and they reviewed it in many of their newspapers, many very positively too. This book got such positive book reviews by the Völkischer Beobachter and all these other Nazi rags, not knowing that this was really a Jewish war diary. That's one interesting thing about it. But Zoltzbach truly believed that he made a distinction between Germans and Nazis, and he was adamant that what was happening in Germany was not one could not attribute this to ordinary Germans, that the country was being held hostage by this far right crowd. And when he left in 1938, his intent was to return to Germany once Hitler was gone. And he was certainly not alone in doing that. Zoltzbach joined the British Home Guard, and then he became he was commissioned as an officer in British intelligence. First, his job was to interrogate German POWs. Later, he worked at a POW camp with a job of working with high-ranking German officers and instilling in them democratic virtues, kind of trying to teach them the wrongs of National Socialism, trying to teach them about democracy just before they're about to be shipped back to Germany so they could reintegrate. Zoltzbach did that. He also volunteered to work with several of the hard cases, as he put it, the SS officers, right? Unrepentant Nazis. That's what he enjoyed doing most. And according to him, this was one of the, he wrote a book about this later. This is one of the best, the most rewarding parts of his life. And he formed friendships with his POWs to such a degree that they formed an association later, kind of a Veterans Association, and Zoltzbach traveled back to Germany to attend, and this is him right here, wearing not only the British medals he won in World War I, but on his chest you also see his British medals in World War II, but on his chest you also see the Iron Crosses from the First World War that he won as a soldier in the Kaiser's army. So really a remarkable story. I talk about this in more detail in this book. He got his German citizenship back, although he stayed in England. And again, for Zoltzbach, this chance of working with German officers and trying to rehabilitate them, this was his moment of redemption, as he put it. His moment of redemption, a means to reclaim his honor and his self-worth. And at this point, I'm really, so hopefully I saw, while I was presenting, I saw questions pop up and things like that. I'm not exactly sure what was going on sometimes, but Mike, maybe if you can.
Yeah, I tried to pull a few questions out of the chat, but there was just some discussion going on there as well. So hopefully if we didn't get your question, just raise your hand and we'll try to get to you. Stephanie asked, what was the situation for service members in the German Navy? I read that the gunnery officer, the Graf Spee, Paul Asher, was half Jewish. Was there a distinction between Navy and the Army?
That's an interesting question, and no, there was not. Certainly after 1933, in terms of how anti-Jewish laws were applied to veterans of the Great War, there were no, or what a former service members, there were no distinctions between Army, Navy, and the Luftwaffe was part of the Army at that time, but no distinctions.
Gary Ginsberg asked, did German Jews serve in World War I at a higher percentage than the German nation at large among the male population?
That's a good question, and no, they did not. They served at equivalent proportions of the German population as a whole. Now, it depends too on where you look. There were certain university towns where German Jewish fraternities en masse. They would put down their books kind of and go to the recruitment depots and volunteer. So in certain towns in Germany, yes, the percentage of the Jewish volunteers was in fact higher, but I think nationwide it was not. And there's a caveat. Another caveat there is that the records that are available on the number of volunteers is not very good. It's not very accurate. A lot of times it was exaggerated. A lot of the records were destroyed in the war, but in general they were seen as being equivalent on a national scale.
Yeah, Michael Senner asked, please touch upon the role of the Verband National Deutsche Juden during that era, and I apologize for my pronunciation.
Yeah, the Verband National Deutscher Juden. This is a really fascinating organization, and I have to say I felt a little bit constrained. And you know, when you write a book, there's so much you have to make hard decisions on what to include and what to leave out. And this is one of the organizations I didn't talk about as much in my book as I'd wanted to. I'd focused on the main Jewish veterans organization, the Reichsbund Jüdischer Frontsoldaten, the Reich Association of War Veterans, which was a very nationalistic, I wouldn't say right-wing group, but a very conservative group. But even more conservative to the right of this was the other group you just mentioned. That's the National Organization of National German Jews, and basically they had their leader. And I'm having one of these moments now where I can't remember anything here. The leader of that organization was also a frontline veteran, a former officer, a former captain, very, very highly decorated, and they took the position that they were Germans first and Jewish second. I mean, they're really adamant about the fact that Jewishness played only a minor, if any, role in their identity. And after 1933, they tried to accommodate themselves with the Nazi regime. They tried to they approached the Nazi Party and Hitler and try to figure out a way where Jews would have some role in the Third Reich, especially these patriotic, quote unquote, German Jews, right? The Nazis, of course, they rebuffed them right away. I mean, this in the Nazi realm of thinking, it didn't matter if you were patriotic. It didn't matter if you were highly decorated. It didn't really matter what you did. The fact that you had Jewish blood flowing in your veins, this was enough to disqualify you from being part of the community. There were only about 5,000 members of this group, so it was a very, very small group. But still, there were Jews who tried to accommodate themselves with Nazism. Yeah. And many of them, they were veterans, not all of them, but many of them were.
Okay, it's a question about Otto Frank, father of Anne Frank, a German veteran of World War I. Did his veteran status affect his experience?
Yeah, I can say something about Otto Frank. He's a fascinating individual as well. He did fight in the German army in World War I. And he became an officer, and he was also awarded the Iron Cross for bravery in the front line. And when he fled, when he emigrated to Holland, and when his family was arrested, there's an interesting scene here where the policemen who arrest him, the Gestapo agent and the regular policemen who are with him, they see that he has a military footlocker that still has his name stenciled on it. And the policeman looks at it, and he looks at Frank and he goes, "You're a veteran of World War I." Otto Frank, he confirms that, and the policeman says, "Why didn't you tell anybody about this? You could have avoided all this. We wouldn't have to do this to you here." And of course that's wrong, because they were at that point they were deporting veterans, of course, to this mythical privileged camp. But it shows you that most Germans believed by 42, 43, they thought that veterans were kind of that they were not suffering the fate of other Jews. That this ruse that the Nazis tried to propagate about a privileged ghetto and exemptions, it seemed to work. That this man believed that Frank would have been safe had he had come forward with his veteran status. Frank was deported. His daughter, as we know, did not survive the war. He did, though, and he stayed in Holland after the war, in the Netherlands.
Here's one from Christopher Nordval. What role did Hitler's experience with Jewish soldiers in World War I influence the development of his anti-Semitism?
That's a really good question, and that's one I really intrigued me from the beginning too. Especially after hearing that Hitler was awarded his Iron Cross by Otto Gutmann, a Jew himself, and of course, if Hitler fought with Jews in the trenches, wasn't he convinced, by what he saw there, these demonstrations of bravery, and did this not? How did he reconcile these contradictions here? And based on recent research, it doesn't seem that Hitler had fully developed his anti-Semitism during the war. And Thomas Weber wrote a really good book about this, Hitler's First War. And he pored over Hitler's letters from the war, and he couldn't find there's really no evidence in all these letters he wrote that he was an anti-Semite. And so the conclusion was that he really formed these beliefs after the war. When things were falling apart in Germany, to make a long story short, we have records of Hitler's early speeches, and we have of comments at meetings that he was at, and he constantly referred to the cowardly Jews in his regiment. He referred to Gutmann himself as a coward. He accused Jews in his regiment of not having earned their decorations honestly, that these were fraudulent decorations, and that they were shirking their duty, and that this was just a means for Jews really to hoodwink Aryan Germans into believing really that they were good citizens of Germany. That this was just a ruse, right? It was just a Jewish means to gain power. All these decorations and serving in the army, and he was unrepentant. He was not convinced. No, that's a really good question, but yeah, there's no evidence that it really swayed Hitler. It didn't generate any sympathy, nor did he grant any Jews exceptions that we know of.
Can you discuss the Jewish census and what it said about German attitudes to their fellow Jewish soldiers?
Yep, also a good question, and this refers to the Jewish census, or also referred to as the Jew count in World War I. And this was a census of Jewish soldiers conducted by the German High Command in 1916. And the reason why a census was conducted was that in 1916, the war was going not poorly. It was going pretty poorly for the Germans, but the victory was no longer assured by that point. They were trying to scrape up all the manpower reserves they could, pulling people out of factories and going after people who were supposedly avoiding their draft. There's a big rush to do that. And of course, there were rumors in the high command, that Jews were not volunteering or serving in adequate numbers in the front lines. That Jews were really populating the rear areas, desk jobs, right, sitting in the supply. There were supply clerks and stuff like this, while real Germans were dying at the front. And so the German High Command, acting on these rumors, they were just rumors. There was no factual basis to these accusations, but just on these rumors, and of course on these stereotypes, it conducted an official census where by, each company commander, each battalion commander, they had a piece of paper and they had to go through and check off how many Jews they had in their regiments, how many were fighting in combat positions, how many were in the rear, in order to determine, if there was any discrepancy. There weren't just Jews, by the way. Danes were also, there was a census on Danish soldiers in the German army and Alsatians as well. But it shows that these stereotypes, that Jews were somehow, disloyal, that their loyalty, it was questioned here, that their ability to fight was questioned. I mean, again, they were just acting on stereotypes and carrying out the census. And crucially, this census didn't prove anything. It was the results show that Jews were serving at the front as all other groups were. And so it did not, it failed to prove these anti-Semites claims. Tragically, news of the census the results were never published. The census, it was known that it was being conducted. So newspapers were writing in 1916, 1917 that Jews were being counted. So people knew that part. But the results were never published. So people never found out that census didn't reveal anything out of the ordinary. It didn't, Jews were not let off the hook for this. So this rumor of Jewish shirking kind of still lingered after, not kind of, it did. It lingered after World War I. So I hope that answered your question.
A quick one here. Professor, do you see any similarity of what's happened here recently in the United States with the Capitol, which remind me of the Reichstag fire, and the lies and the bigotry and racism expressed by our leader? Do you see any similarity to Germany in the 1920s? Has this built up over the years, the putsch in Munich in 1923? You see a history there, a danger there? Thank you. Enjoy. Thank you.
To be sure, I see. I mean, one can find similarities. I'm not. I don't want to comment too much on contemporary developments like that here, because I am, my official capacity as a professor at West Point. I want to be clear that these are, I'll be clear and say that these are my views and not West Point's views here when I say this. But sure, there are parallels. I'm not sure if the Reichstag fire or if Kristallnacht, I think Arnold Schwarzenegger, the former governor of California, made that comparison there. And I'm not sure if that's a really good comparison or comparison of our government leaders to Hitler. I'm always kind of uneasy when people compare other individuals to Hitler. One thing I did find interesting, though, throughout the years, is that in Weimar Germany, in 1933, when Hitler came to power, he later described this as a seizure of power, quote unquote, seizure of power. And a seizure of power, it was not. He was appointed by Hindenburg and other conservatives in the government. And these conservatives, they clearly believed that Hitler was, what they were interested in, they thought Hitler was kind of a useful idiot. They didn't really care about his views, but they cared about his political base. He was one of the only leaders that was able to mobilize a good, by that time, by 1933, he had about 30% of the population. And that's what Hindenburg and the conservatives wanted. They wanted that base. And they thought if they would have put him in the Reichstag, that they would they would be able to manipulate that for their own purposes, and that he was an empty vessel that they could kind of fill with any kind of ideological, whatever they wanted to. After Hitler turned the tables on them, it's amazing how many conservatives stayed in power and accommodated them, stayed in the government and accommodated themselves with the regime. Conservatives who really turned their backs on some of the values that they had professed throughout the Weimar years in the early 1933. They made their peace with Hitler and really became reliable fellow travelers. Now, not all of them, but reliable fellow travelers. And I thought that this was really disconcerting here too. And again, I don't want to draw too many parallels here to today's climate, but certainly there are cases of that happening as well. But I hope that answers your questions. It was kind of a roundabout answer, but and again, that's just my personal view.
Yeah, Peter had a question in the chat. Peter Rosenbluth. The 100,000 Jews in World War I, is that defined by the Nazi definition of Jewish, and would the number be different if calculated in a different way in terms of who's considered a Jew?
Yeah, good, very, very good question. So the 100,000 Jewish soldiers who served in World War I, that number refers to religious Jews. So those individuals who identified themselves as belonging to the Jewish faith. And that was very easy to deter. German enlistment records, I think American enlistment records still do too, your dog tags, right? They say if you're Jewish or Protestant or Catholic or something like that. And the same in the German enlistment records. So we have a very precise documents. So those were 100,000 Jews. They did not include people who had converted to Christianity, for example. The same with the Jewish census of 1916. This was not based on what was considered race, right? The Jews who were counted as Jewish were those who belonged to the Jewish religion and who marked it down on their enlistment documents. Only later, after 1933, did this notion of race really enter the picture, where being Jewish, it didn't really matter if you were if you were a practicing Jew or not. It didn't even matter if your grandparents had already converted to Christianity. If you had if you had Jewish blood, you were considered a Jew according to the Nazis' definition.
Did these censuses and everything else, did they include the principalities' armies, for example, the Bavarian army? I had a first cousin twice removed who fought in the Bavarian army in Italy, in the mountains.
Okay, yes, they did. They included all the German contingents, the Bavarian, Württemberg, Prussian, everyone. And actually, these are, it's fortunate that they did have separate Bavarian armies, and Württemberg had a separate army, and Baden had a separate army, because most of the World War I military records were destroyed. German records were destroyed in Potsdam in World War II during a bombing raid there. But they survived in Munich. They survived to a large degree in Munich and in Stuttgart. They survived there, so you can go and see the records of the census in those archives. Yeah.
Professor, kind of a concurrent question. In his book, Mark Riggs, about Jews and German, Hitler's Jewish soldiers, talks about, like, from 1933 on, of hundreds of thousands of Jews and Mischlinge, mixed Jews, or proportionate Jews, who kind of went through the same thing that you described for the German Jewish veterans, in terms of whether they were allowed to stay in the army or not, whether their parents were safe or not, and whether they or not had a career and a place in German society, very much parallel to the religious Jewish soldiers. Can you discuss how those two streams either flowed together or diverged?
Yeah, very, very good question. And for those of you who don't know, we're talking about the book by Brian Marks Riggs, Hitler's Jewish Soldiers. I think it came out in the late 1990s, if I'm not mistaken. But a very, very good book. It was one of the first books I read on this subject. And Riggs, he looks at a different group of people. He looks at Jews of partial birth, those who had a Jewish father, for example, and a Christian mother, a non-Jewish mother, or had a Jewish grandfather, quote unquote quarter Jews. And how they experienced the Third Reich. And what's interesting in their case was the vast majority of them never considered themselves Jewish at all. They'd never been told that they were Jewish until that moment. Many of them didn't even know until there were some background checks done on them, and it was determined that they were Jewish. And in many ways, they fought for some of the same reasons. And they were, by the way, they were drafted into the army. The reason why they were is because the army, of course, they were much more pragmatic than the SS, right? They saw this as a valuable manpower pool. I think there were 400, 500,000 of these Germans of partial Jewish heritage, and they wanted to draft them in the army, and they served there. And if you look at these Jews that Riggs examined, they also fight for the same reasons, right? They wanted to overturn these negative stereotypes that were ascribed to them, negative stereotypes of being disloyal, negative stereotypes of not being physically fit, right? Of effeminacy. So they wanted to overcome this, and they wanted to prove themselves in the hopes that if they did perform well, then maybe they would not be persecuted, and most importantly, too, their families would also receive exemptions. In some cases that happened, and in some cases it did not. What's interesting here is that many of these Germans of partial Jewish descent, they served in the Wehrmacht, so they fought on the Eastern Front. Some of them may have participated in atrocities or not. We don't know that, but I think there are many parallels here. A lot of similarities, but more than differences. But still, these are still a different group, a different generation, a different cohort.
Research question. Do you have any recommendations for finding German World War I records? I submitted paperwork to request my great-grandfather's records, but haven't heard back. I understand that most of the records were destroyed in a very specific bombing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do, and I think that's just one of the things we just briefly mentioned was the bombing destroyed most of the German military records, which were housed in Potsdam. These were the records of the Prussian army, but there were also other military headquarters in Munich and Stuttgart and Karlsruhe too. That's a capital of Baden, and they have archives there where you can find where the World War I records survived almost intact. And I know in the case of the German military archives in Munich, they recently put not recently, this was even years ago, they put a large trove of documents onto Ancestry.com. Because when I went there, I asked them, I wanted to look at records of Freikorps to see how many Jews served there and army records. And he's like, oh, you don't have to go through these files. Look at Ancestry. And he kind of showed it to me. I did ask for the files anyway, but it's on there. And so I think you'd be able to look there. Most archives, if you can, and by the way, feel free to email me after this. Too, if you're running, if you can't make any headway, my email address is on the faculty page at West Point. It's easy to find. I can help you out here, but you can also try, once you determine which unit he served in, you can see if you can email the archive directly. German archives they don't answer right away like they do here in the United States. It sometimes takes 2 weeks to get an answer, but they will get back to you. But try Ancestry, especially looking at if your relative was in the Bavarian side, then you might be able to get an answer there.
You mentioned your Freikorps research. There were a couple of people asking about Jews in the Freikorps. Can you expand on that at all?
Yeah, but I'd love to. I do write a little bit about this in my book. And I was fascinated by this because the Freikorps, there is this myth of the Freikorps that really these were far-right organizations after the Weimar Republic who went around and started to brutalize Jews, assassinate enemies of the Republic, assassinate socialists and Democrats, and in Poland and Eastern Europe really fought a brutal war against Polish nationalists. And as with many myths, there is some truth to that, but that's really not the whole story. After the Nazi seizure of power, there were many Freikorps veterans in the Nazi Party, and they really tried to create this narrative where they saw the First World War as really the birth of the Nazi Party that really went from the trenches of the First World War. Those disgruntled and angered veterans, they organized themselves into the Freikorps to kind of fight this democratic, unjust state, right? And that they would later morph into the Nazi Party. This is a narrative that the Nazis themselves created. And interesting enough, historians have adopted this narrative too. They write about the Freikorps in the same way, right? As kind of the vanguard of Nazism. But if you look at certain areas in Germany, like in Würzburg, for example, and in Munich, you'll find that a lot, and I found that a lot of Jewish veterans served in the Freikorps as well. In Würzburg, for example, this is a small town in Franconia. There was also a communist uprising in 1918, 1919. It was very brief. They took control of the town hall and then they drove them off. But this really scared the population, right? I mean, all of a sudden these communists are in charge, and if you are a middle class shop owner, this can be a scary prospect. So many people in Würzburg, they formed their own Freikorps, and at least 17 local Jews were part of it. One of the 4 battalions. One of the battalion commander was a Jewish former officer. Another was a company commander, a Jewish company commander. This unit marched down to Munich and helped suppress the communist uprising there. There were also Jewish-led Freikorps fighting in the east against Polish nationalists in East Prussia and Silesia there. So I was really surprised to hear that, but it was really much more so than has been discussed so far. Freikorps veterans were also exempt, as veterans were from the early Nazi legislation. It kind of challenges this myth, right, of the Freikorps really being this forerunner, of National Socialism. It was really not that.
Yes, this is Mark Wilson. Can you hear me?
I can hear you now. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I'm interested in the officer corps. What was the highest rank that you came across for a Jewish officer prior to World War II in Germany?
Prior to World War II, the highest rank I came across was a major. That was a major, and he was a baptized Jew, so he converted, and he made it up to major. Yeah, from Düsseldorf.
And did they have any specialties such as intelligence or engineering type of fields?
Soldiers in general, or?
In general or specifically, whatever you could talk about.
No, not really, and it's interesting that you mentioned that. I really like that question because it leads me into something one of these things I just didn't have time to talk about. Jewish soldiers overwhelmingly volunteered for artillery and infantry units during World War I. I came across many diaries where Jews were assigned to rear echelon units. The German army really had a bad intelligence section. It was one of the reasons why they kept on losing. I mean, they really had horrible intelligence, so they didn't invest a lot of manpower to that. But many Jews who were put in MOSs, or positions behind the lines, they protested this because we had their letters, and they would volunteer for frontline service. Because according to them, they didn't want to come home and be the stereotypical weak and cowardly Jew. Remember, they're out there to try to disprove these stereotypes. They wanted to come back as having fought on the front line. So there wasn't any specialty there, but there was certainly, if we look at patterns during World War I, this was certainly a common reaction for Jews who weren't immediately stationed at the front. This attempt to get there, to be in the thick of the action.
Military. Do you have any information on Austro-Hungarian Jews?
If you can hear me, this is Ivan Vamos.
Yeah.
and I'm a survivor as well. And my grandfather was in the Austro-Hungarian army, an officer. As far as a little kid, me, was concerned, he was a very high-level officer, but I don't know. Then he was called in sometime around late 42, along with a lot of colleagues, and he was dumped off in front of the house a couple of weeks later, theoretically to die, but he survived. And his complaint was that he was beaten every day by a subaltern, and this is not befitting an officer.
Mm-hmm.
He just didn't understand how this could happen.
Mm-hmm.
So he apparently thought a lot about his service during World War I.
Mm-hmm.
Relatively proud of it.
Yeah, that's a tragic story, and it's a reminder that that not all Jewish former officers or not all Jewish veterans that that they were able to take advantage of privileges or friends in high places, right? I mean, many Jewish veterans too, they suffered as you just described, and some of them they were deported to the east during the Holocaust. The story you told reminds me of another man, Edmund Hada, who was also deported to Theresienstadt, and he complained about the same thing. He complained about he wrote in his diary, how dare they? I was an officer, I was a captain. How dare they not give me my own room here, in a concentration camp? How dare they make me sleep on the floor with 10 other people in the same room? And he wasn't being sarcastic. He was insulted that he was not being treated like an officer, right? And you hear that sentiment again and again. Yeah.
All right, that's just about all the time we have. So just to let people know, we do have the book for sale in the museum bookstore, and I'm sure you can also order it from your local bookstore and definitely on Amazon.
Well, thank you everybody for the questions. I really learned a lot during this talk. It's amazing. I get a lot of insights, especially from a crowd like this. So thank you for the questions. And as I mentioned before, thank you for having me here. It's been a real honor to be at the National Museum of American Jewish Military History. I hope I can physically be at the museum soon.